Hello, my name is Dr. Cassie Jacobs. This is for Social Work 727 at VCU, and today I'm going to just provide a brief introduction to trauma treatment. So we're going to start with the importance of building a working alliance. So, in order for a client to achieve any of their goals in therapy, whether that means finding self-acceptance or healing from trauma, it's really critical that they know that they can share any of their thoughts, feelings, or experiences without fear or being judged or shamed. Oftentimes, it's the internalized judgment or shame that has been experienced at the hands of others that is the fuel for a lot of the things that bring people to trauma therapy. So it is essential for the therapist to establish trust by meeting the client where they are, not pushing them before they're ready, and going at the client's pace. The Working Alliance inventory has been used to research the impact of therapeutic relationships. It's also really important that we talk about safety and stabilization when you're talking about healing and trauma work. Recovery from trauma cannot take place without sufficient stability to be able to remember the past without becoming overwhelmed and even potentially re-traumatized. Utilizing psychoeducation as clients begin to cognitively achieve safety and stability is really important. Psychoeducation teaches about symptoms, how to recognize them, how to anticipate them, what they mean, how to manage them. It also works to decrease shame, confusion, and a lot of feelings about othering. Trauma psychoeducation helps a client to see that symptoms are evidence of the autonomic nervous system, which we've talked about in previous modules, and the protective response, and not a weakness of the client themselves. In addition, psychoeducation can talk to clients about how feelings and reactions are expected and understandable. So, to provide some evidence here, a 2018 study found that 12 sessions of trauma-informed psychoeducation positively impacted Somali refugee youth by reducing their PTSD symptoms and increasing their perception of social support. Even a single session of trauma psychoeducation can help, which was indicated by 98% of people in a 2016 study that reported the session as helpful. It also led to increased use of mental health services and improvement in symptoms like anxiety and depression. So I've mentioned window of tolerance in previous modules. It's very likely it will be mentioned in future modules because it has been a huge asset in trauma-focused work. It was developed by Dan Siegel, Dr. Dan Siegel, to describe the optimal zone of arousal for a person to function in everyday life. It's a good idea if you're thinking and talking about window of tolerance in therapy to work with clients to broaden their window of tolerance, and at the same time to recognize clients' presentation and to not work on trauma processing when they are outside their window of tolerance. So you may recognize where they are, but the client also has to recognize where they are in the window of tolerance. And, if they're in that hyperarousal state or that hypoarousal state, that's not where you're going to do the work. That's as a therapist, you have to recognize that if your client is in those states in a therapy session, to take a step back. So we need to talk a little bit about the trauma narrative. There are some models that have trauma narratives built in and some that do not. So the trauma narrative is a psychological technique that's used to help people that have experienced trauma make sense of their experiences. It also acts as a form of exposure to painful memories. Without treatment, memories of trauma can feel like a jumbled mess. For some people, it feels like a wash of images, sounds, and emotions that are difficult to make sense of. So, trauma survivors can benefit from telling their stories because it helps them understand reactions and then they can learn to more effectively manage those reactions. Trauma narratives have also proven to give people hope, which in turn reduces withdrawal and isolation behaviors that are common with trauma. This treatment, so trauma narrative based work, provides support because it allows people to listen to stories, hopefully without judgment. Um, and then through repeated stories, survivors get to gain perspective that the trauma is in the past and they have the power to move forward. So there are specific steps for using trauma narratives in treatment, and it is a consistent process that should be followed. But please note that the speed of progression will vary for each client and their own situations, and it's important for clinicians to use professional judgment to determine that pace. So you want to make sure that you're engaging in psychoeducation, helping the client create a solid base of understanding about trauma, um, working with the client to create. So the next step would be creating the narrative. That step can take many sessions. The number of sessions and the speed, again, depends on a variety of factors, including the client's comfort level, how detailed the information is that they share, and your own professional judgment. The next thing is you're going to begin with the facts of the client's traumatic experience. You're going to encourage them to include details as to the who, what, where, when, and why. Um, and again, there doesn't have to be a why. If that proves too difficult, the client can break down the experience into the before, during, and after. Once they're comfortable enough with the factual details, then they can write them down. So after the facts are in the trauma narrative, then it's a good idea to add emotions and thoughts. And you can lead your client through those, asking open-ended questions, letting them know that they can add to the facts as they need to flesh out details. This is not the part where you should dig in deep. This is where a lot of encouragement is helpful. Um, the next thing to remember is there's going to be progress through discomfort. Once the client feels more comfortable with telling and writing their story, then it becomes time to focus on the more uncomfortable parts. You very likely will ask the client to dig deeper into some of the most difficult parts of their trauma to add as much detail as possible. And this is a part of the narrative where it's important to go as slow as the client needs and sometimes pause along the way. Next thing to keep in mind is that there's going to be challenging of irrational thoughts. And so this is where cognitive skills come in. Reviewing the narrative, challenging any irrational thoughts, encouraging your client to think about how they're framing the story, and if they want to revise any sections. And again, just like all the other pieces, this can take time. So the next part is to add learning and growth experiences. Once the story has been updated, ask the client to compare their feelings now to when the trauma happened and then to when therapy began. Have their feelings changed? And if they have, what's changed? Do they feel like their strength has shifted? What have they learned? If they feel like they could answer this question, what may they potentially advise someone in the same situation? Questions like that, open-ended questions, can help the growth that your client has experienced and help them move forward. So trauma narrative has to do with trauma processing. The next slide does say trauma processing. But I wanted to talk briefly about the meaning-making model, which I don't think is discussed a lot. So the meaning-making model has the global perspective. And remember, so the global perspective is people's fundamental and overarching beliefs and hierarchies of goals and values. The situational perspective is how global meaning influences things to a situation. And the meaning-making model basically talks about how the two interact with an event. So I have a figure on the next slide that I think will help. So the meaning-making model here is based on a growing body of research that looks at how people respond to adversity, like serious illness, bereavement, sexual assault, um, incest, COVID-19, natural disasters, and terrorist attacks. And this is research that started in 2017 and is still going by Park and Blake, Fitzke, and a whole bunch of other researchers. And as I mentioned before, the model looks at two different levels of meaning: global, so people's overarching beliefs, and situational, how global meaning influences things to a particular situation. So we know that severe trauma can interrupt a person's global meaning. Meaning making typically involves cognitive processing. And basically, the idea is that people can change their appraisal to better integrate themselves and come to see events as less damaging or even positive. So for appraisals of events that are highly difficult, meaning making can require changing one's global meaning to accommodate the trauma. What people do regularly is they look for ways to view the situation in a more positive light. They focus on identifying positive attributes to an event, and they remind themselves of those benefits. These are really common meaning-making strategies. So basically, what people have been doing for a while, we're now calling meaning-making, and it's something that we use a lot in trauma therapy. There was a longitudinal study of a national sample of Americans that found that these people were attempting to make meaning of highly stressful or traumatic events through positive reappraisal. And when they did this, they had higher levels of positive mood and lower levels of negative mood years later. A bunch of studies have been done in the last 3 years that have looked at how individuals have dealt with the COVID-19 pandemic and how different strategies that they use to make meaning of the pandemic impacted their life in positive ways. And some of those things that they did included positive reinterpretation of the pandemic, trying to look at it through a potential benefit model. So, how could I look at the pandemic in a positive way? How can I accept that this is the reality and I have to live in it? So, the question I just want you all to think about is how can you apply this meaning making model to trauma work? So I want to talk about phase-oriented treatment for complex PTSD. This is, an approach to therapy that addresses domains of functioning in a sequential manner. Dr. Judy Herman is who I'm going to talk about in more detail. Her model talks about it through the lens of safety, remembrance, and mourning and reconnection. You're reading Bessel van der Kolk's book. He also had a 5-step model, which is safety, stabilization, desensitization, cognitive processing, and reconnection. I'm not going to talk about Bessel's model, but I'm going to talk about Judith Herman's. So the first step of Herman's model for navigating complex trauma is safety. And basically, what Herman says in her book is that a traumatic event can destroy assumptions about safety. She talks about how shame and guilt often fuel the negative experience. And in this phase, it's really important that trauma therapists make sure that they get a really good history and they understand whether the client has experienced dissociation and the severity of their PTSD, that the client and the therapist have to set the pace together, and that together they need to determine what their needs are for stabilization and determine how to move towards the second stage, which I mentioned before is remembrance and mourning. Oftentimes, clients want to move through the first stage quickly and get to the healing, but safety and stabilization are critical to having success with resolving traumas later. In this stage, the client and the therapist begin to work on strategies that help the client feel less overwhelmed and more likely to stay within the window of tolerance. As I mentioned earlier in this lecture, when a client is outside of their window of tolerance, they're more likely to feel overwhelmed with panic, anxiety, anger, depression. There are lots of different strategies that trauma therapists use in this phase. The entire goal is to help the client feel safe and calm and secure. One strategy is the container. So the idea is to create a box in your mind to put memories or feelings in so that you can come back to them at a later time when you're ready. The box can be made of wood, steel, plastic. It could have a latch or a large lock, but only the client has the key. To determine what strategies are most helpful to achieve the sense of control over emotions and memories needs to be a collaborative effort between the client and the therapist. So the next stage is remembrance and mourning. And according to Dr. Herman, trauma resolves only when the survivor develops a new mental schema for understanding what has happened. During stage 2, the client tells the story of their traumatic experiences to the therapist. And as the therapist, it's really important that you talk and coach the client to begin to put words or feelings on the memory if possible. There's often a lot of disassociation, sometimes long term, so this can be challenging. It is essential to affirm clients in this stage and discuss how sharing parts of their experience is a sign of courage and strength. Sharing parts of experiences or being willing to confront them is incredibly courageous. It's also important to remind clients that going back to strategies that were learned and practiced in phase 1 throughout the remembrance and mourning process is essential, and it will help keep clients in the window of tolerance. There needs to be a balance between feeling safe and facing the past here, so the client must decide the pace of the work together with the therapist, with the client as the leader. There is no limit on the length of time that you spend in each of the 3 stages of recovery or how many times a client goes back to an earlier stage. There are so many aspects to traumatic memories, including beliefs about oneself, beliefs about others, beliefs about relationships. And some aspects of traumatic memories may get stuck in the nervous system, as we talked about in prior modules. So the goal of this stage of recovery is to really just heal from the trauma. Um, so through the shift in new beliefs, the client is going to hopefully potentially feel more positive about connections with the world and themselves and relationships. So the relationship with the therapist is crucial here. The therapist must normalize responses and provide the client with language to use to describe their experience while constantly listening to their story without judgment and a lot of understanding. The other thing that I want to highlight about this phase is in this phase, the therapist needs to help the client construct a new interpretation of their traumatic experience that's not based on shame or guilt. Stage 2 can feel like putting together a really difficult puzzle, and patience is important. Some clients feel like they make progress and they get stuck. Some clients feel like there's no movement. And as the therapist, you likely will feel like and can see that there is. So there's a lot of communication happening here. So the third stage is reconnection. And it's really important during this final stage, the clients devote time and energy to taking care of themselves. According to Herman, this means taking care of the body, environment, material needs, and relationships with others. The goal is to emerge with a sense of empowerment and reconnection. In this process, clients may revisit issues related to safety that they did in the first stage. Clients may need to reestablish a sense of safety as they approach reconnecting with others. This stage is really an opportunity to create a new self, to let go, to forgive themselves. And for many clients, they feel like they can really protect themselves in this stage. It's so important when doing trauma work to never make promises, to never say to a client, like, you're going to be 100% better, because under stress, PTSD symptoms can reoccur. But it's a good idea to always go back to those original strategies that, you worked on in phase 1, stay within the window of tolerance, um, because that will help with each of these stages. So I briefly want to touch on neglect-informed therapy. This is from Ruth Kahn's work. She wrote the book Working with the Developmental Trauma of Childhood Neglect. Neglect can be seen as a lesser trauma. That's not really the case. Trauma by definition is an overwhelming experience, which means the stimulus is greater than what the brain and the nervous system are designed to process in their customary way. And this is Ruth's words. So Ruth also says that neglect is the panoply of essential missing experiences without which survival and well-being may be compromised and potentially threatened. Both can dysregulate the brain and the body and leave their mark on virtually all aspects of human functioning. It would be a disservice if we didn't talk about cultural competence in treatment. It is essential that as a provider, you look at your own positionality, your privilege, the ways that we can do harm. This happens all the time. How biological, physiological, developmental, cultural, and societal components impact the treatment that you facilitate. The harm that can be done while proposing safety or treatment without acknowledging ongoing barriers or trauma exposures. I've seen this happen a lot with clients that engage in self-harming, and then a provider immediately creates a plan without completely understanding the dynamics around that. So it's not just about cultural competence, it's really about understanding your positionality. I encourage every single clinician to write their own positionality statement and consistently update it, because your positionality is going to change. By being a trauma practitioner, you are in a level of power, and it's important to acknowledge that power and acknowledge your positionality, because you are working with a oftentimes vulnerable population. And by acknowledging your positionality, you are going to be in a different place than a provider who may not be willing to do that work. So that's our lecture for today. I know this was a little bit long. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to our next conversation. Have a nice day. Thanks.